Hello everyone, this is Charlie from the Bloomingdale Public Library and welcome to Introduction to 3D Modeling using Blender. A warning before we get started. Blender is a very powerful and complicated program, so it's easy to get lost quickly. If you've ever been using a program, even Chrome or Word, and you accidentally hit a key and it makes things appear or disappear or behave differently, and you don't know how to get out of it, Blender has a lot of potential for that. That's the downfall of a powerful program is a single keystroke or key combination can drastically change the way things look and behave. So I'll show you a few ways to get to where you want to be, but otherwise you can feel free to close and reopen the program without losing too much time. We're not going to be building to some grand project over the course of the video. Instead, it's going to be learning tools and techniques a couple minutes at a time. So to fully learn and master everything that Blender has to offer would take several college-level courses and hundreds of hours of practice. That's being conservative. You can literally create a 3D world and bring it to life. Blender has all the tools to do that. But rather than try to rush to that point or anywhere near it, we're going to be taking our time today. We're going to go slowly, develop a foundation, and hopefully you'll appreciate how easy it is to learn a little bit at a time while also seeing the potential to do things in the future. So the goals for this video will be to teach you how to download, install, and set up Blender, get an understanding of the interface. We're going to be general and brief. Some of these menus are very deep and complicated. We're going to scratch the surface of creating and editing 3D objects. I promise you, you will be able to create something and make it look like something. And after that, we're going to tell you a few other places you can go to continue your Blender learning. So with all of that said, what is Blender? Blender is a free, open source, professional level 3D content creation suite. Blender has tools for 3D modeling, texturing, sculpting, rendering, simulating, animating, and much more. Blender can be used to create objects for 3D prototyping and printing, scientific modeling, game development, and even full cinematic movies. So if you were interested in game development, the Unreal Engine and the Unity engine are two engines that are also available for free, and you can use what you create in Blender and import those into the Unity or Unreal engines. Blender has seen a huge uptick in investment and development, meaning there are more and better tools added to the suite all the time. So even if you were to get to that point where you feel you've completely mastered Blender, they've been releasing new tools and reshaping what there already is more and more rapidly. And because of that, it can be hard to find up-to-date tutorials even on the internet. But most of what is out there will carry over to the later versions. What is mostly being developed are new tools focusing on 3D animation and the node editor, which we're not going to get into today. Okay, so this is the part where we download and install Blender. I've already gone ahead and done that. I planned to do it on video, but it took a little too long to download and install, probably because I'm recording at the same time. But I think you'll get the basic gist of it. All you need to get Blender going is a computer and a connection to the internet. And if you don't have a connection to the internet, you can bring a flash drive into the library and we can go ahead and download it and put it on there for you, and then you'll be able to run the installer from home. So for those of you with a computer and an internet connection, go ahead and open up your favorite browser, or your second favorite browser is fine too. And once you're open, go ahead to blender.org. And this is the Blender homepage. On the page, you see very prominently a Download Blender 2.91.0 button. We're going to go ahead and click on that. If you're watching this video at a later time, the number might be a little bigger, but it's the one you want. And it takes you to a second screen where if you're running Windows, you go ahead and click on the big blue button again. If you're running Mac OS or Linux, you click on this drop-down box and choose the download that works for you. So once you click on that, it'll start to download. And you go ahead and click on the download and run the installer program. It'll ask you to accept the GNU license It will ask you which folder you'd like to install to. I usually prefer the default folders. If you're someone using multiple hard drives or you don't want to install something on your bootable solid state drive, you might want to choose a different folder. But once you go ahead and make those selections, you're going to wind up at a window that looks like this. So I will go ahead and close the browser, click the Finish button, and now we can go ahead and open Blender. And it looks like this key with a bunch of extra legs. So the first time you open Blender, it'll look like this. You'll see we have a couple options here. Language, choose the one that fits for you. Shortcuts, I choose to use Blender shortcuts, but if you've been using something else like Maya or 3D Max, maybe you might want to choose different shortcuts. Select with, it's set to left by default, but if you've used Blender in the past, it used to select with right. So if you ran Blender on your computer sometime over a year ago, you might want to make sure that you're set to left. The spacebar can do several different things. By default, it plays the playhead for animating, and we're not going to be doing anything like that, and I generally don't. So you can choose tools or search if that makes more sense to you. Otherwise, just be aware that if you hit the spacebar, your timeline is going to start to see a little bit of action. You're going to see the playhead move. And if that does happen, you just hit spacebar again and move the playhead back to 0. And for theme, I got it set to dark by default, but there's a whole bunch of other options if you want to look at those. So go ahead and click Next. And this will be what you see every time afterwards when you open Blender. You have the options to open new files, open old files, and choose from the manuals. Just going to go ahead and click outside of that. And that is your default starting project setup. You start with a cube, a camera, and a light. Again, that's just by default, and you can change those defaults if you like, but we're not going to cover that in this class. Okay, so we're looking at our default setup. Before we start doing anything, let's try to make a little bit of sense of what we're looking at. There's a whole lot here, and we're not going to be messing with most of it today, but it's still a good idea to know what it is, just in case you accidentally click on something. So we'll start in the upper left. This is our main menu. The File menu looks similar to many you've seen before, with import and exporting, available, new, open, and saving and quitting. Editing is where you do your preferences, and you also have your undo and redo options. Otherwise, it's Control-Z to undo, which is pretty typical of most programs, but it's Shift-Control-Z to redo. Rendering window, we won't look at, and help is where you would go to pull up the manual. And there's a lot of helpful documentation in the online manual. To the right of that are workspaces. So we're going to stick with the layout workspace. You might want to use the modeling workspace once you get the feel of things, but just to have a look at what some of them look like, you'll notice when we do modeling, we lose the timeline at the bottom, and some things happen with our properties panel. Sculpting is a whole nother ball game. When you start looking at UV editing, that's how you put pictures on the faces of things. Texture paint, animation, put some bigger emphasis on the timeline. You get the point. So if you accidentally wind up in one of these workspaces, it would probably be very confusing if you didn't know what you were looking at. And if that is the case, you just go ahead and click on Layout, and you go back to where we were. Just below that, you'll see this little picture in the just all the way far left, right below the main menu. This is the editor menu. There's a whole lot here that we're not going to really touch, but just to give you an idea of what something like some of these can look like. Again, if you accidentally wind up at any of these places, they're very different from what you're used to looking at by default. Again, we want the 3D viewport. It's the first one there. That brings us back to where we want to be. Below that is the mode menu. We've got the object mode, which is the default, edit mode, which we will be using later, and a few others. Again, It doesn't look that different, but all of a sudden your mouse changes. Sculpt mode, again, very different behavior. We want to be in object mode to start. And like I said, we'll be looking at editing mode later. This main big area in the middle is considered the viewport. That's where all of our content will be. And that's where we'll be editing our objects and things like that. On the left side of the viewport are our tools. We've got the select box, which works like you would imagine, like a regular select box. The 3D cursor, which we'll use very briefly. And then we've got move, rotate, and scale. If you ever find you're missing your tools, it's because you hit the T button. If you hit T, they'll go away. If you hit T again, it'll bring them back. So at the very bottom, you can't really see too much of it, but that's our timeline. Again, we're not going to be using that very much. And if you accidentally hit space, you can see the playhead take off. Just hit space again, bring it back to 0. Below that, you'll see some descriptions of what buttons will do. If you start holding down other buttons or selecting other things, you'll notice what you can do changes. It's context sensitive, so if you're not sure what you can do when you're holding control or while you're doing things with the mouse, you can look down there and sometimes you can get a little bit of help. In the upper right corner over here, this is the outliner, and any object you put into the viewport will appear here. It's very convenient for finding things and selecting things, so we'll be using that a little bit later. And below that is the properties panel, which there is a whole lot going on with, and we're not going to be looking at any of it today. So I overlooked a couple other things, but we're really not going to be using too much other than what we've discussed, and nothing else will really take you to someplace unfamiliar. So we'll look at a few other things as we go along, but otherwise that's pretty much the gist of what we're looking at. Before we start creating or editing, we need to know how to move around the viewport. And we have a couple options available to us. We can orbit, pan, and zoom. So let's start with orbiting. In order to orbit, you would hold down the middle mouse key and simply drag the mouse left, right, up, down, and around. Alternatively, you can use the numbers on the number pad. So you can use 4 and 6 to rotate, I guess it would be clockwise and counterclockwise, 8 and 2 to go up and down. And I believe those are in 15-degree increments. You can also use the 3, 1, and 7 keys to align with the X, Y, and Z axes respectively, and the 9 key to flip around to the other side. If you don't have a number pad and you'd like to use the number pad option, what you can do is go to the Edit menu, go to Preferences, go to Input, and then at the top we have Emulate Number Pad. If you check that, the numbers at the top of the keyboard will act as though they're part of the number pad. I actually have access to a number pad on this laptop, so I'm going to leave that unchecked. So I'm going to go back to our previous view. We're actually underneath the cube. Our next option is panning. In order to pan, we're going to hold down the Shift key, and again, hold down the middle mouse button. And as I go left and right, up and down, and around, that is how you pan. Alternatively, again, you can use the number pad keys. You just have to hold down Control. So if I hold down Control and press 8, 2, 4, and 6, you can see I pan up, down, left, right, respectively. Our final option is zooming, and that should come pretty naturally. You just use the mouse wheel. So you scroll down to go away, up to go close, And again, you can use the keyboard if you like by holding down Control and using the minus and plus keys. One other option available in case you get lost in your viewport, if you have a lot of options, that can certainly happen. I'm going to shift away for a little bit here. If you use the number pad period, it will center you on the selected object. So again, it might not seem like such a big deal with just a cube sitting here in the middle of our viewport, but if things get a little cluttered and you have something selected and you get lost, you can go ahead and select or center on your selected item by hitting the numpad period. All right, I think it's time we start playing with our cube, but not too much or we might go blind. So we want to make sure we're in the object mode, which we should be by default. And then we're going to have a look at our tools on the left here. I'm going to move my window just slightly to the right because my recording interface is getting in the way of the tools. So to have a look at the top bunch of these here, we've got the selection tool, which basically you click and drag and it selects everything in the box. You can click and drag to the right and you have a few other selection options as well. The tool below that is the 3D cursor. We'll talk about that briefly a little bit later. Now we've got the move tool, the rotate tool, the scale tool, and the transform tool, which is a combination of the previous three. We'll start with the move tool. Go ahead and click on move, select our object, and you see we have 3 arrows, one for each axis, and 3 squares, also one for each axis. If you click and drag on any of the arrows, it will move the object about that axis. So the blue arrow is the z-axis, the green is the y, and the red is the x, if you weren't aware. If you wanted to click on one of the squares, what that will do is lock that axis and let you move about the other two. So like I said, the red arrow is the x-axis, but if I click on the red square, it locks that axis and lets us move about the y and the z axes. Same thing if you click on the blue square, it locks the z-axis and lets you move about the x and the y axes. The shortcut for move is G. Think of G for grab. So I'll go ahead and get off of the move tool. I can hit G and it lets you move about the plane of the viewport. In other words, it's basically parallel with the screen. It's kind of hard to visualize, which is why I don't really recommend going about it this way. However, if you have your object selected and you hit G and then X, or G and then Y, or G and then Z, you can lock the axis like you did before. The next tool is rotate. Go ahead and click on that. With our object selected, we get these little rings around our object. So you simply click and drag on any of the rings, and your object will rotate about that axis. Again, I will deselect. You can use the R key to rotate. Again, it's going to spin on a plane that's parallel to the screen, or you can hit R and then X, Y, or Z. And that will lock that axis. From there, I'm going to undo those changes. I'm using Control-Z to undo. We have the Scale tool, so I'll click on the Scale tool. There we go. And it looks very much like the Move tool, except we have cubes at the end. And it works pretty much the same way. If you click and drag on any one of the little cubes at the end of the sticks there, it'll scale about that axis. If you click on any of the squares, it will lock that axis and scale about the other two. The shortcut for that is S, and just like the previous tools, if you hit S and then X, Y, or Z, it will lock the axes that you scale on to the X, Y, or Z axis. Just for some craziness, we'll go ahead and click on the Transform tool. And like I said, it's a combination of all three. And as crazy as it looks, everything acts the same as it did with the individual tools. And that's all there is to it. We had a lot of fun playing with our cube, but perhaps we want to play with something else. So make sure we're still in object mode. Click on the Add menu, roll over Mesh, and select UV Sphere. Now we have a sphere in our viewport. Except you can't really see it. You can see it is selected, but is completely contained within the cube. The reason for that is anytime that you add an object, it's going to be centered on the 3D origin, which, as you can see, is located at the center of the sphere on the origin. So we're going to go ahead and click the Move tool, drag on the Z-axis. Now we can see our sphere. So, knowing what we know, let's go ahead and click on the 3D cursor and put it somewhere else. It's kind of hard to put the 3D cursor someplace. It's going to be on a plane parallel with the screen, basically. But I generally use it to just make sure that you're not stacking your objects on top of each other. So just put it somewhere else, add an object, and then if you wanted to move it somewhere else, we can do that after the fact. So we'll go to Add, Mesh. This time, let's choose Cylinder. And as you can see, the cylinder was placed centered on the 3D cursor. So with a couple of objects in our viewport, we can go ahead and use our select box to select them. Or if you have a cluttered viewport and you're having trouble selecting items, you can hold down the Shift key and click on the individual objects. If you wanted to deselect something from the group, with Shift held down, you can simply click on it again. Although you notice that there's a highlight around the object and it's not deselecting. That's because there's a couple functions in Blender that require knowing which object was selected last. So if you Shift click on an object and it is not the last one selected, it's not going to deselect. It's just going to make it the last selected. So you're going to have to first make an object the last selected of the group, and then Shift click on it again, and you can deselect it from the group. As you may have noticed when we added our objects, they were also added in the upper right to our outliner. So we'll have a quick look at the outliner and a few of the functions that we can do with that. First thing we can do, we'll start with our sphere. If you wanted to rename it, you can simply double click on Sphere and we'll name it Globe. Otherwise, if you keep adding spheres, they're going to be named Sphere 1, Sphere 2, Sphere 3, and as you start editing the spheres into something else, the names aren't going to make sense. So it's usually a good idea to rename your objects as you add them in the outliner. Another thing you might notice is everything has an eyeball next to it, and that's the visibility. If you have trouble editing things because things are cluttered and in the way, it can help to simply click on the eyeball and it will make the object disappear. They're still there, it's just their visibility is turned off. So you can toggle the visibility on and off with the eyeballs next to the objects in the outliner. Another thing you can use the outliner for is finding things. So if you wanted to select something and you have trouble, again, because your viewport's cluttered, but you don't want to turn off the visibility, you can select things in the outliner instead. And if you have trouble finding it still, and we can shift everything over, you can go ahead and find the item you want to highlight and focus on, in the outliner, make sure your cursor is back over the viewport, and use the numpad period, and it will center on the selected object. So with object selected in the object mode, if you click on object, there's a whole bunch of other things you can do to an object. You can also right click, which will bring up some of the more popular items. Other things you can do include copying, pasting, deleting, and duplicating. If you hold down Shift and D, simply drag, and there you go. Up until now, everything we've been doing has been in object mode. And object mode is generally for adding and deleting objects and doing some basic transforms, as well as goofing around with their properties, which, like I said, we're not going to be messing with in this video. If you really wanted to start messing with the geometry of an object, you need to go into edit mode. So with our object selected here, we'll stick with our cube. We're going to go up where it says object mode, use the drop down menu, and go to edit mode. You can also use tab, that's the shortcut. Everything looks pretty much the same as it did before. We've got a few extra tools on the left of our viewport. But you'll notice we can see our vertices a little more prominently, and we've got a few more options up here by the mode menu, including vertex select, edge select, and face select modes for our selection tool, as well as a couple more menu options to the right of that. So by default, everything will be selected in edit mode. And if you use any of the tools from before, or move, or scale, or rotate, I'm going to shift my window over so I can get at them. They will behave pretty much as they did before. So generally speaking, you don't enter edit mode to perform transforms on the object as a whole. I'm going to use Control-Z to undo all of those transforms. Generally, you use edit mode to manipulate parts of an object. So to unselect everything, you double tap the A key. If you want to reselect everything, hit the A key once. I'm going to go back to unselected. And now with our, again, we've got the vertex select mode. I'm going to use the select tool and drag and select just one vertex. With one vertex selected, again, we can go ahead and use all the tools that we used before. I'll go ahead and use the move tool. Because a vertex only has 0 dimensions, we can't do anything besides move it. It's simply a point in space. Something to be aware of when you're in edit mode is Blender will try to keep everything connected. It'll keep all your faces and edges connected to the vertices, and because of that, you can turn your object inside out or cause things to collide in a way that you don't want. So be careful when you start moving things around. And I'm going to use Control-Z to put our box back. Just like in object mode, you can select multiple vertices and move them, rotate them, and scale them as a single object. To demonstrate some of the other modes, I'll click on the edge select mode, and now you notice we select edges instead of vertices. Also, just like object mode, you can use Shift to select, as well as the select box to select multiple pieces of an object, and again, move them, scale them, and rotate them all together. Again, I'm going to undo all of that. And just to show with face select, I'm going to click on just the one. And that's how that works. So one thing to be aware of, and it will definitely come up, is when you use the select tool, go ahead and select everything, you only select what you see. To demonstrate that, as you can see, I selected the cube here, and I'm going to try to move it. And you can see I've got a vertex hanging out there. If I put it back, orbit around, you'll notice that I didn't get the vertex that was hidden behind the cube. In order to get the select tool to get things that are obscured by the object, you can either orbit around and use shift to select it, or it can be very cool and also very confusing. You go to the upper right, and these are the viewport shading options. And if you click the wireframe, now you can see everything. And with the select tool, you can select everything as well. While playing around with our cube, I'm sure you were having a blast, but probably thinking that only having 8 vertices and 6 faces to play with was kind of limiting. And you're right. So we're going to discuss how to create a bit more geometry so we can make more complex shapes. With our cube selected, we're going to go back to edit mode. I'm going to zoom in a bit here. And now I'm going to right click in space here. It'll bring up a context menu. And the first option in that menu is subdivide. And when I click subdivide, basically everything gets cut in half. So we've got more vertices, edges, and faces to play with, allowing us to do a bit more than we had before. You'll also notice that we've got this little subdivide window hiding in the lower left corner. If we do anything else, this window goes away. So if you wanted to do more with the subdivide tool, after doing a subdivide, you need to click on this window. And as you can see, we've got a bunch of options here we can play with. The only one I'm worried about right now is number of cuts. And so by default, it does 1 cut. But you can either enter in another number or click and drag the mouse, and you can get a whole lot more cuts. With each cut, you're basically dividing your faces in half over and over again, and that gives you a whole lot more to work with, allowing you to make much more complex shapes. So I'm going to hit Control Z to go back to our cube without subdivides, just to show you you can also do one side at a time. So I'm going to just click on the top face. I'm going to face select mode, click on the top face, right click, subdivide, and as you can see, it only affects the top this time. We can do a few more cuts. And so that would be a way to limit how many faces you're creating at a time. Something to be wary of, the more faces, vertices, and edges you create, the more flexibility you have in terms of the shape that you can create. But it will also slow down your computer if you start getting into the thousands, tens of thousands, and even the millions eventually. You're going to suffer a significant amount of slowdown unless you have a very strong computer to handle it. And when it comes to rendering, you're going to be spending hours rendering something when it gets into the millions. So, subdividing is one way we can create more geometry. And just to show you a way to select things other than using the select tool, if you choose a square out of here, you can hold the Control plus, and it will increase the selection radius on the object. And if you hold down Control and hit minus, it will shrink that radius. So it's just a helpful way of selecting polygons that doesn't involve the select tool. And it can be extremely helpful when your shape starts getting very complicated and curvy, and it's hard to select everything at once. And just to show an example of what we can do here, we'll hit Control plus a few times, choose the move tool, and as you can see, we can really start doing some crazy things. I'm going to hit Control minus to select a little less, move it around a little bit more, Control minus, select less one more time, and that's a kind of interesting little shape there. One other way that we can create geometry that won't warp the original shape is extrude. To do that, you can select a vertex, an edge, or a face. I'll choose this guy right here. And then just hit the E key. It will push that shape away from the rest of the object, but it will also create faces as you push it away. So again, you hit E to extrude, pull it out. You can see it's also locking it on an axis springing from the center of the object. And with everything selected there, you can rotate. Hit E again, extrude. And from here, you can see how I can basically use the extrude tool as a 3D pen. We're going to cover one more topic before I direct you to other resources, and that is combining two objects together. You might need to do that if you wanted to put a head on a torso or a handle on a coffee mug or something like that. So I'm going to show you a few ways to do that. I'm going to start by deleting our cube, and instead I'm going to add two UV spheres. There's just a bit more geometry to work with, and this will help us get started a little more quickly. There we go. So you'll remember earlier in the video when I told you it mattered what order you select things in, and joining objects is one of those cases. When you select multiple objects and join them together, they're going to be merged into the last one selected. So if you see over in the outliner, we have sphere and sphere 1. I'm going to have sphere 1 selected, select our original sphere, go to the object menu, and click join. And when you look over in the outliner, we only have the sphere left. In other words, both of these spheres are now considered a part of the sphere object, and sphere 1 is no more. So with both of them now as a single object, I'm going to go to edit mode. I'm going to double tap A to deselect everything. Okay, and let's have a look at our options. We'll start off with the vertex select options. I'm going to select one vertex on one sphere, select one on the other sphere, and I'm going to right click to see our vertex context menu. The option I'm going to use is merge vertices, and so this will basically turn both of these vertices into a single vertice. And you can either do it at the first one selected, last one selected, in the middle, at the cursor, or collapse. So if I do at the first one selected, you see the vertex goes and jumps over to the other sphere. I'm going to undo that, and instead I'm going to do merge vertices at center, and that looks a little bit more like what we'd want. So in order to finish this up, you would select one vertex from one sphere, one vertex from the other, and you'd keep doing this until you get everything looking pretty. I think you get the point. So I'm going to undo that. Now we can look at our edge options. So with the edge select mode, I'm going to select an edge on each sphere, right click, and now the option that I'm going to look at here is bridge edge loops. So when I do that, you see we have a face connecting both of the edges. We also have a new little window here with a few more options. I'm going to get out of this by undoing, and instead now I'm going to select 4 edges on one sphere. Oops. 4 edges on the other sphere by holding Shift. I'm going to right click. Now we'll do those bridge edge loops again, and you see this time we've got a full connection around the entire square. And if we want to try some more of our options here, we can look at some of these. If I click merge, you see a different result. And I'll leave it to you to mess with that a little bit more. I'm going to back out of that and instead go to face selection mode instead. I'm going to deselect everything. Choose a face on one, choose a face on the other, right click, and in case you haven't noticed, we're getting different context menus depending on which select mode we're using. We started with the vertex context mode, then the edge context mode, now we're in the face context menu, and I am going to do bridge faces. And that looks very similar to what we had with the edge selection because it basically is. We're using a bridge edge loop menu just like we did before. So those are a few ways that you can combine two different objects. Again, it looks kind of dirty here, but if you take your time with it, you can make it look a lot more neat. Going forward with your Blender education, you have a bunch of options available to you, and these are just a few. The first one is lynda.org, which is a paid subscription service, but you can get access to it with a BPL library card through our website. There's also the official Blender online manual, which doesn't have tutorials, but it's a good place to go to learn how to do things, and it's always up to date. You also have the official Blender YouTube channel, which also has a ton of tutorials free to everybody. And if you found Blender a bit overwhelming, or you just wanted to take a smaller step forward in 3D modeling, there's Tinkercad, which is a free cloud-based 3D modeling program. If you go to their website, you create an account, they have a lot of tutorials available that make everything pretty easy to understand. But again, there's a lot less to know, and there's a lot less capabilities when compared to Blender. So I can go ahead and show these to you right now. This is our website, mybpl.org. You go to Learn, click on Online Courses, click on lynda.com, and then you put in your library card number and your library card PIN. If you don't know what that is, you can call the library and we can help you with that. And then the first time signing in, you'll need to use a first name, last name, and email address. And from there, you'll be able to search their entire database where you can find things on Blender, as well as the Microsoft Office suite, Adobe suite, any programming language you can imagine. It's a very good technical resource that I recommend you have a look at. This is the Blender official online reference manual. Again, you've got all the topics on the left. Go ahead and click on whatever you want to look at. Lots of links and always up to date. Here's a look at the Blender official YouTube channel. Again, there's a whole lot available. Feel free to have a look. And this is Tinkercad.com. Again, you'd have to create an account in order to do anything, and everything is saved in the cloud. But if you do create something that you wanted to have a copy of, you can download whatever you create. So that's all I've got for you. I appreciate you listening in on the video. And if you have any questions, feel free to come into the library and have a chat. Again, thank you for listening, and I hope you all have a good day.